Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. Today we're continuing our Aspiring Intellectuals coverage. This is a special coverage where we have longer and harder conversations on more foundational topics with our guests on a wide range of scientific and philosophical issues. And today, I'm very honored to have Greg Lewis joining us. He is an economist and the senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and he co-leads the ALICE project, which is short for Automated Learning and Intelligence for Causation and Economics, which is an effort to develop economic AI in artificial intelligence. So he specializes in industrial organization, market design, applied econometrics, and machine learning, and he's trying to unify the twin goals of making better sense of microeconomic data and using those insights to optimize firm decision-making and improve market performance. So Professor Lewis, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And co-hosting the show with me is my friend Harsh Babla, who is a senior in the electrical engineering department at Princeton, who also does research in quantum information and machine learning. So he's again coming here to guide me through the technical and scientific aspect of those things, because I know nothing about science. So
happy to be here, Tiger, and very looking forward to this interview.
Professor Lewis, maybe we can. I said a lot of buzzwords probably at the beginning. I don't want to overwhelm anybody, but I guess. Would you mind first starting off the interview by telling us a little bit more about who you are and what your general research interests are?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm an economist is probably the word I'd use first of all. I got a Ph.D. in economics from Michigan back in the day, and before that I did economics and statistics in South Africa. And so the way that I look at the world is very much like an economist. I think a lot about efficiency, about trade-offs, about welfare, about how to improve market performance. But I've spent a lot of time now at Microsoft. I've actually been there almost 7 years now, which is surprising to me. It's been quite a while. And you know, at Microsoft Research, I think a lot more about machine learning and about how we can automate some of the processes by which we either improve performance or we make sense of data. And those are maybe the two big things. I mean, the world we live in today is a world where especially tech companies are sitting on mountains of data, and they're very curious of how to understand their data better and to allow that to then allow them to inform how they offer better products or how they provide better solutions.
So maybe also a word about Microsoft Research. I suppose it is not purely doing market or business research, but it's also thinking a lot of the fundamental questions.
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft Research is an amazing organization. It's been around, I think, since the 90s, and you know, I haven't been there long enough to give you the exact history. You know, and it's really had this fundamental mission of making sure that Microsoft doesn't fall behind the technological frontier, right? So at the time, Microsoft was one of the world's biggest companies. It still is, and they were very concerned that the future would get there before they did. And so one of the big stories about Microsoft Research is, you know, that at some point some Microsoft researchers said, hey, I think that, you know, having maps is going to be very important. We should really get into the game of maps. And people were like, no. And then Google Maps came along. Or, oh, I really think that sort of like these devices that are portable that we should use will be very important. And then they're like, no. And then the iPhone came along. So it kind of didn't quite work in the sense that it sounds like a lot of the ideas, and of course, this is a story we tell inside Microsoft Research, you know, so it's a little bit self-serving, but a lot of these ideas were anticipated from the research side, but didn't get a lot of buy-in on the corporate side. But people have been thinking about these things for a long time. And it's really a place that's supposed to be in the style of Bell Labs, which obviously, you know, did create the future. We know a lot about how well Bell Labs did. And so, yeah, we're just trying to be a little bit ahead of the game. That's our goal.
That sounds great. I guess maybe we can quickly pivot into some of your specific papers or research just to get everybody a sense of what is going on, because you wrote this very interesting paper called "You Can Lead a Horse to Water: Spatial Learning and Path Dependence in Consumer Search," where you introduced a model of search by imperfectly informed consumers with unit demand, and you found how consumers learn spatially, and all those very cool ideas. So maybe would you mind explaining some of your main findings in layman's language?
Yeah. So let me say that, you know, this is really a paper that's trying to offer a formal economic model of something that people do all the time, which is that people want to buy a car or decide on a daycare, or decide on a camera. And they're trying to make some choice. And the unit demand thing is a technical thing that says that they just want to buy one of these things. They want to choose a daycare or go get a camera, as opposed to, say, news consumption, where you might be happy to read many, many news articles, right? So this is a model of that search process. And the big idea in this paper is to ask, how do I model a process in which I can start off and I already have some information about the world? So I'm not just going off at random. A lot of the classic models in economics are essentially urn models, in the sense of like a Greek urn, sort of antiquity, right? And there, if you ever took any of these statistics classes in undergrad, I certainly did, you might think about like getting balls out of an urn, and some of them are red and then some of them are blue, and there's a question of how many of each you're going to get, and it's right. So it's that kind of model. Here in economics, there are classic models. People have won Nobel prizes for these models, in which people are going around looking for a job, say, and they're drawing out wages from this urn. They're like, oh, that's $34,000 a year. Is that good enough? 36, is that good enough? And what they're trying to figure out is it's costly to engage in search. It's costly to sit around trying to find a job. It's costly being unemployed relative to having a job. And so you're trying to figure out, at what point am I willing to settle? What's the settling point? But in those kinds of models, really, you are drawing these objects out of an urn, and they're not differentiated. But when you think about most things we do in the modern world, of course, we start off with a lot of information. There are lots of paths that are differentiated that we can go down. It can be, should I look for a job in management consulting, or should I look for a job in tech? Should I look for a camera that's digital, or do I want something that has a fancy zoom? There are all these options. And once you go down one path, of course, then your opinion about everything starts changing, right? So as you start going down one path, you think, oh, now I know more about the process. I know that, in fact, digital cameras seem to have got much better than I thought they used to be. Now I want to search more heavily for digital cameras than I thought I wanted to initially. And that's really the heart of this paper, is trying to understand what happens in a process that has learning as you go, and therefore path dependence. And it turns out that's mathematically difficult, which is why people haven't written these papers very much before. But it's realistic, we think, very realistic.
So you base this realistic model on like spatial learning, right? And you say that objects were sort of close to each other. If you learn more about something, you sort of update your beliefs on the objects were closer together, much more than So if you're looking at a camera, you'll probably update that closer to like a TV screen, or something which is or like a high-end monitor, or something which is very familiar to like photographers and stuff, as opposed to like a boat or like a So could you explain that a little bit more, and like why you sort of came up with that, and like how that sort of works?
Yeah. So this is sort of the key idea in the paper, right? So what's happening in this paper is I go out. I like to give the example of daycare because I had to look for daycare for my kids recently. You're trying to choose a daycare, and you go out into the world and you have some beliefs about what you think might be good, and then you go and you try something. And so maybe you try the small private daycare that's a little bit away from you, right? And now it turns out when you actually go there, you have a pretty bad experience. You don't end up liking the teachers that much. You don't think it's actually a good fit for your kid. Now the question is, what do you do with that information? Of course, the easy thing to do is to say, I don't like that daycare. That's easy. The harder thing to do is to say, okay, but how do I feel about all the other daycares in light of that? And the idea of the spatial learning is to say, well, I'm going to find people that I think are similar, and things that I think are similar to this daycare, I'm going to update on negatively. So I'm going to say private daycares, maybe a little bit less good than I thought they would be. That travel, I don't like the commute. So far away daycares, I'm not really so interested in them anymore. And so this is a model where really the key idea is that people that are close to you in some space, and there's, I mean this mathematically, so in the sense of like points in Euclidean space, are now going to, if you have a bad experience at one, we're going to think that all the other ones close to it are bad. But the ones that are very far away, I'm going to have very little updating. And so this is kind of realistic, and I'm going to back up to kind of like a high level concept for a second, because I think it's interesting. And we definitely thought about when we were writing the paper, is, there are really two ways of learning at some sort of fundamental level. There's interpolation and extrapolation. So there's either, this thing is kind of close. My brain has some mental model of the world, and it says, oh, these two things are kind of close. I learned about the one thing. I really like skiing. I probably like snowboarding too, right? That sort of thing that's close. The other way to do it is to do it off like an actual model of the world and extrapolate, to say, I understand logically how these things are related. And so I know if, so you have a physics model, I know that if this thing happens, then this thing should also happen too. That second one is very logical and complicated, but the other one, the interpolation one, is what our brain does sort of subconsciously all the time. We're forever wandering around the world going, oh yeah, that thing's like that thing. I like this thing, therefore I like this other thing. Or I don't like this thing, therefore I probably won't like this other thing.
So Professor Lewis, just to clarify a little bit more, are you examining this from a consumer's perspective or from a platform perspective? Do you look into their algorithm, or so when Expedia is filtering their search results, or Airbnb or your daycare Google site, are they kind of implicitly or explicitly using some of those economic models to update the information they present you? Like, how does the back of the scene work?
Yeah. Lots of questions. Great, but
sorry, I mushed everything in.
It's good. I mean, I just want to break them apart. I think what you're doing is breaking apart the main actors here, which is great.
Yeah.
So one actor is the consumer. They're sitting around choosing a daycare. They're kind of the heart of this model. What we're really trying to do is figure out what's a good description of how consumers behave. And then you can ask, okay, in this world where consumers are behaving this way, what are the platforms doing that they're searching on, or what should they do? And what are the firms doing that are selling these products, right? We don't pay a lot of attention in this paper to the firms that are selling the products, although of course, product design is an obvious element here, right? You might think, for example, that if people learn spatially and there's a product that's currently looking like everybody loves it, I don't know, like a Peloton maybe. It seems like people really like Pelotons right now, right? Like, it's probably not a bad idea to build something that's close to that product, because you're going to benefit from the halo effect, right? People are going to say, oh, I like this. I probably would like your product too. If you build something that looks like Peloton that's way cheaper, maybe you'll get some traffic, although of course you're going to compete very aggressively with Peloton if you build something really close. So there's pros and cons. But we don't worry about that at the moment. What we pay most attention to is the consumer and then the platform. And the platform, as you say, has this huge ability to influence what you see, what information you consume, and therefore what you're going to do. And so one of the punchlines of this paper is this gives, in a world with path dependence, platforms have a kind of power that maybe hadn't been paid a lot of attention to in the economics literature before this, which is that they can influence your beliefs by putting different products sort of right in front of you. So if a platform wants you to think badly of a particular kind of product, what they really want to do is show you a bad example of that kind of product. So they want you to believe that alternatives, I'll say something kind of alternatives to a Kindle, other e-readers are not great. What I really want to market to you is bad other e-readers, so that when you read them, when you kind of delve into the research on them, you go, oh no, those are terribly reviewed. Everybody agrees that Kindles are better. And then you go and buy Kindle instead, right? So that's the sort of thing that I might try to do. Now, whether platforms do this in practice is, of course, a completely different question. This is very much in the realm of they could do this. Whether they do this is a different thing.
So this impact or this influence that platforms have on consumers' choice and like the way consumers think about products and stuff also sort of has some sort of ethics issues as well, right? Like Amazon competes with a lot of other businesses which sell products on their site. So and can use this influence that they have for anti-competitive behaviors. Like, what do you think is like the limits to this?
Ooh, the limits are really interesting. I think so I feel like we don't actually have amazing answers to this yet, but there's huge interest in economics literature on this because of the antitrust issues. And there are scholars who have definitely thought about this. But I think the limits are, if Amazon gives you a very bad experience consistently with their search results, you might not use Amazon anymore, right? That's sort of where the limit lies. If I know that I'm looking for the hottest Christmas gift this year, whatever it is, I forget what it is in the classic movie, some sort of BB gun, I don't remember. That there's some sort of like thing, and Amazon just doesn't return that to me because they don't want me to buy that thing. They want me to buy something else that has a higher margin for them. I might leave Amazon out. I'll say what's going on, right? So there's a limit in that consumers, especially consumers who are well-informed, know sort of what they want. They expect to be shown those results. But having said that, when consumers signal that they're not that certain about what they want, so for example, they enter a generic search term instead of a specific search term, then the platform has a lot of discretion. they kind of know from the fact that you haven't entered a specific search term that you're not entirely sure what you want. Now they get to choose what they want to show you. And of course, depending on the deals that they've struck with the various merchants, some of these things would be more or less profitable for them to show you. And so, I think there's a tension here. And the tension really is the market disciplining force is, if I don't like what I'm getting from Amazon, I'll go to Target or I'll go to Walmart and get those things, especially now that they're offering more competing services. But if I'm getting a pretty good deal from Amazon, in fact, if Amazon in general is the better place for me to shop than Walmart and Target, maybe given that constraint, Amazon on any particular one thing I'm trying to buy can steer me in a direction they want.
So Professor Lewis, just to kind of piece all the big ideas that you talked about together. So I guess the big picture is that whenever a consumer goes on one of those aggregator platforms that has a lot of information, they tend to do this thing called spatial learning, which is I want to keep scrolling through products that are closer to each other. I'm on the camera section. I keep going down the list of cameras. And then the platform also recommends me in that way. But what you found is really interesting is that the platform can steer the consumers away from a certain space of products or something by simply ranking a bad product that immediately turns people off. So they simply go away, or when the consumer is ambiguous, the platform has a lot of power in terms of what shows you as the top ranking product, because that would kind of incentivize the consumer to purchase something. So that's kind of the big picture implications of spatial learning and platform power.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that ties together beautifully. The only thing I'd say as a caveat is it's not clear, as we say, that the platforms actually do this, right? So they could do this. But of course, if I show you a really bad product first, you might take that as a signal that it's time to leave and go to Target, right? So platforms have to be pretty careful how they use that power, right? They can do this, we think, but they need to be careful. And they also need to know how, there's a question of how much information you have as a consumer, right? If you're very uninformed, this might work. If you're very informed, you might go, why would you show me that? That's a terrible search result, right? And so that could backfire.
So I want to go back to this idea of like modeling spatial learning. So a lot of times sampling or getting the price for something might be costly, right? You mentioned daycare centers. So like, you can't figure out if a daycare center is good or bad unless sort of you send your child there, which can be quite costly. So, so how do you create that mapping of products in this higher dimensional Euclidean space without sort of knowing what their cost is sampling first?
Yeah, so the formal model has two kinds of sets of attributes. So there are things that you know before you search that are just very easy to obtain. So in the case of daycares, maybe it's very easy for me to find about basic information about them from the website, say. And then there are things that are harder for me to know without, say, doing an actual visit. I mean, worst case scenario, there are things that would be hard to know without sending my kid there, but most of the time that's not in the model because we're thinking about you make a choice and then you're done, right? But yeah, so there's things that are easy to find out initially, and then things that are already easy to find out when I visit. And so the question here is, I'm going to go visit things. I don't want to visit every daycare center because that's going to take forever. We'll look at every camera on Amazon because it'll take forever. I'm trying to figure things out pretty quickly and efficiently. Like in the classic models of wage search, I want a job. I don't want a job, 2 years from now. So I have to make a choice at some point. And so what I do is I try to economize by visiting places and then seeing what performance I get, seeing what my opinion of them is afterwards. And then saying, okay, now I know a lot more about all the other daycares that are similar to this daycare. And so this leads to an interesting dynamic that happens in our model, which is an explore-exploit trade-off, right? So the explore idea is, if I'm going to visit daycares, I might visit the private one that's far away, but then I might want to visit the public one that's just down the street. And those are two very different daycares. And so now I've learned a lot about two different parts of the attribute space. Right, I know something about these daycares over here and these daycares over here. So now I know a lot more about all of them. And so if I'm in if I'm in a three-dimensional space, I might want to visit kind of pretty far apart places because I'm going to learn a lot around each of those points. But at some point, I kind of know which ones I think are the best ones. And now I'm just trying to make a decision among all the, say, private faraway daycares. I've decided that's what I'm going to go for. Which is the right one? Now I want to zoom right in and exploit. And so one of the things we show in our data, which replicates some data from, replicates an exercise done in a marketing paper by people at Duke and Stanford, Mark Cronenberg, Carl Meller, and a co-author of theirs, is that consumers definitely do this zooming in thing at the end of their search process. So at the end of the search process, they kind of know where they want to be, and they just look really, really closely in that area. But what we're pointing out is that before you do that, you're going to want to explore, because you're going to want to know where to zoom in, and you don't know where to zoom in initially.
So it seems like this. There seems to be a lot of subjectivity associated with this mapping, right? From actual products to this mathematical space, and how do these results sort of translate to in real life with like the simulations you've done, and how sort of do you take these real life data and sort of map your things a little bit better?
Yeah, so I come from a field of industrial organization, and a lot of the work there is this field called structural industrial organization, structural IO. And the big idea in structural IO is that we write down models and then we take them seriously, and because that's sort of how we're going to make sense of the world. So you have this world that's super messy. You're going to filter it through this model, and then you're going to have something that's cleaner and easier to work with. And of course, depending on the fidelity of your model to the world, that may be a good or a bad exercise, right? And so we're going to take this model very seriously. And then if this model is correct, all of the data that we see, how long consumers search, which ones products they end up choosing, but where they also start, which tells us something about what they thought was going to be good, as well as where they end up, which tells us something about where they eventually end up. The variance in that, how different people are and where they choose to start, how different people are and where they choose to end up, all of that is going to inform essentially the parameters of this model. So what we do is this model is characterized by a bunch of parameters, things like how consumers value these different characteristics that they can observe in advance, things like how good the product ends up turning out to be in terms of a payoff or a utility in the language of economics, right? And then the way that we connect the data that we have on these search trajectories to these parameters, describing, say, the search cost is another one, right? Is through maximum likelihood. So we're using a particular statistical procedure, which has, very good properties and has been studied for quite a while. And so that's how the mapping works. And what does this tell you about the world? Well, it allows you to run counterfactuals. It allows you to say, if the world was different in this particular way, what would happen? And so we do some of those. We do things like, what would happen if the platform decided to, how effective could the platform be at trying to get you to buy a particular product, right? And we can do that manipulation. We can say, well, the platform could make you buy this, look at this thing first, and then it could drive you far away from the thing you wanted to buy. What would happen?
Professor Lewis, I'm going to wear my economics student hat right now and ask you probably a little bit more about industrial organization, which is a field that I think is very distant from especially undergrads, because I think in undergrad careers, whether it's undergrad econometrics or statistics, we learn a lot of techniques that are, regressions, all kinds of regressions. So yeah. If you have wages and you have years of education and you have other factors, how do you relate them together and kind of arrive at some kind of applied microeconomic insights? Whereas industrial organization, we're macro modeling, where we're looking at productivity. I mean, these questions, they're not really taught in undergrad economics. And the math and modeling sounds extremely complex. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the field and also kind of what is happening here.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, undergrad industrial organization is really focused on these important insights around, mergers and market power, how to think about entry and investment by firms, right? So these are all kind of very foundational theory concepts. But when you try to turn to data, it turns out that the theory models look like toy models. They're just too simple. They're designed to be that way. They're designed to allow you to understand things, in a clean way. But the world is really complicated. And so you end up writing down much more complicated models. And then because your models are complicated, you end up doing a lot more complicated estimation. So to give you an example, you think about wage regressions. A model of the world is that wages are linearly related to years of experience and years of education, et cetera, et cetera. That's a model. It's a statement about how I think the world works. There's a linear relationship between these things and these things. It's just a really simple model, right? Then there are complicated models like, I think that the way the consumers search is this entire path trajectory thing, right? And when I move from simple to complicated models, the techniques get a lot more complicated. What does this mean? It means that the only people who ever do this stuff are people who have PhDs in economics, pretty much, because you end up having to go through a couple of years of graduate IO, which is, generally at most colleges one of the hardest possible sequences in grad school. Subjectively, you get a lot of the smartest kids in that subfield, because you have to know so many things. You have to be able to understand econometrics. You have to be able to understand game theory. So you have to be good at theory. You have to be good at metrics. You have to be interested in doing applied stuff. You have to be able to put them all together. And you have to get used to the idea that it's going to take you, papers often get published in 5-6 years. So you're going to get used to the idea that you will be working on these things for a long time, which is, even super smart people might go, that's just not my preferred time trajectory. I'd like to be done with things in 2-3 years, so.
Yeah, because I was reading some of your papers with Harsh, and I noticed that I would have to say that I think even first-year PhD students would struggle to understand some of the concepts in your paper, because so I'm currently taking the first-year PhD econometrics class with Professor Chris Sims, who is a Bayesian, and he won the Nobel Prize a while ago, and he most of his problem sets and concepts that he teaches us are lots of Bayesian stuff, a lot of simulations, which is very, very different from undergrad level kind of regressions, thinking about that. He lets us run simulations and program in like Julia or Python or things like that. So nice. I guess I'm trying to get a sense from you. It's like, how does simulation work? We keep hearing this word. Updating beliefs, generating draws from some kind of distribution, and then you arrive at some results. So I watched some of your lectures, and you mentioned these phrases a lot. And I think to our average listeners or even undergraduate student, how would you explain these concepts to them? Or even to graduate students? So.
Well, it's a great question. I was trying to think about how to parse it. I think I would say that there are already two kinds of simulations that we run. So one kind of simulation is a way of sort of elucidating what's going on in a theory model. So, and theorists will do this. So theorists will write down a model of the world, very smart people, but before they'll go and prove some result about the world, they'll just go and check if it holds in a set of examples. So you might make up an example, and you might have, for example, I'm trying to think of I can't think of a good theorem off the top of my head. I'm not that inventive. But you've got some theorem that you're trying to prove, and it says something about consumers. It says, for example, that the distribution of purchases made by consumers is going to follow a normal distribution, or in a macro model, maybe the distribution of consumption is going to follow a normal distribution. Okay, that's a claim. You're going to try to prove a theorem about that. Maybe you're going to check if consumers are obeying all the rules of your system that you've just established, and they're making their purchase decisions optimally, their consumption decisions optimally given their income or whatever. You could just run people through this little process and ask, at the end of the day, does the distribution of consumption look like it's normal? If it does, you might carry on and try to prove a theorem about it. If it doesn't, you go, oh, I see, I'm wrong about this. I will not try to prove that theorem. I will think about what's going wrong in my model and maybe change the model, or maybe change the theorem statement or whatever, right? So that's like one class of checking kind of. The other kind of checking is an econometrics checking. And this is where we run Monte Carlo simulations, right? And Monte Carlos, as people often call them. And that second kind of checking says, look, I have a statistical technique that says, given data, I'm going to correctly recover the truth about the world. So how does this work? There's truth, which generates through some model a data set. Consumers behave according to the following rules, truth. If they do that, there will be data. That data, by the way, is going to always be noisy. In all econometrics models, there's some things that you don't see about the consumers. They like things, or they have more income than you thought they had, or something. So there's some noise in your data set that doesn't make it obvious what the truth is. But you apply your clever statistical procedure that's going to try and average out the noise and tell me back truth again. So you go truth, data, truth. Now, the trick is, if you start with truth, do you get back truth in this little process? That's the Monte Carlo. And you want to do that lots of times in lots of different ways and check that you, generally speaking, get back truth. Now, there's always noise, so you're not going to get back exactly the truth, but on average, it should be right. And that's what that does. Again, a nice kind of checking. I've proposed some estimation procedure or some very clever machine learning or whatever I want. Do I get back the truth? If you don't, bad estimator. Don't use it. If you do, okay, maybe you can prove a theorem.
I see, but okay, I guess this is really getting into interesting, slightly theoretical territories. Harsh is going to hate me for asking some more econ questions per se, but
you're good, Tiger. Go for it.
This idea of truth versus data, I think it's centered at a lot of the econometrics debate between like Bayesians and frequentists, and also yeah. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. Like, are we able to uncover truth? Is there an objective truth that exists in the data set? I mean, these are questions that people talk about.
Now we're into like full-on philosophy, right? Like,
yes, let's do it.
Truth, maybe, I don't know. That's pretty hard. But I mean, you are pointing to a really big thing, this classical versus frequent, so classical / frequentist versus Bayesian debate, right? And so, a Bayesian kind of approach to the world says, I have some beliefs, you give me data, and I come back with new beliefs. And I think that's how pretty much everybody actually behaves in practice. We're all sitting around here, we all have our own priors or our own life experiences, which lead us to think of the world in a particular way. We get some data and we update. But for most intents and purposes, if you're trying to study how people behave, that's kind of how they behave. But in econometrics, we've actually gone a slightly different direction, which has an equally long and beautiful academic history, which says, no, it's better to think about the world as having a truth that I'm trying to uncover. There are some parameters. So the easiest case is, you think about line fitting, right? There is some slope to this line in reality. And this maybe comes from like physics. I mean, in physics, there is a truth, right? There is some there's some constants and some coefficients that relate different things, right? Gravity has a particular mathematical form to it, right? And I just want to know what that is. So now I'm trying to figure out, if there is an objective truth, which in some cases of physical systems there often is, how do I get it back, right? I mean, these things are not incompatible. So you might start off as a Bayesian and run experiments. And if I run experiments for long enough about gravity, I will probably coincide with the frequentists who are trying to figure out what the truth is. In fact, I will agree that eventually that my posterior beliefs are a point mass at the truth, right? But there's this slight difference along all paths that, that might take a long time in some cases. In the case of economic systems, of course, it may take a very long time because there is no truth or the truth keeps changing or whatever.
So I want to go, spend more time on this point about methods and how you sort of look for the truth and uncover the truth. And you sort of have this vision that that machine learning models and deep learning models and neural nets can replace traditional statistical models to sort of uncover this truth. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. It's sort of a pet topic of mine. So, I think that machine learning is just another kind of statistics. But it's one that pays a lot of attention to computational aspects. So in line fitting, so if I want to fit a line to a set of points, that's a statistical technique. It's typically called ordinary least squares, OLS, and it has an analytic closed form. So when I want to know what that slope is, I can solve for it, and it's very quick because it involves a bunch of inversion of matrices. Turns out that's not that hard to do, although I have colleagues who've tried to figure out how to do it fast. And if you could figure out how to invert matrices faster, that would be a big deal for many companies, including Microsoft. Just random aside, like these very small mathematical things actually matter quite a lot because there are a lot of computers doing a lot of matrix inversion a lot, right? But anyway, okay, so that's a thing. So then statisticians continued forward in the literature and eventually said, well, we want more complicated, more flexible models. And they started to think about how you could fit those and how you could learn about inference on those. So how confident you are given a set of data set, particular data set, that the thing you're returning is the truth. Machine learning, one of the things that's true in econometrics, and maybe a little bit less on statistics, but very much true in econometrics, is that what we say is you write down a model, you write down a criterion function, which is a thing that tells you about the quality of the fit of your data to that model at a particular set of parameters. And then we go ahead and we optimize this. We try and find the set of parameters which maximizes this criterion function or minimizes it. Okay. And economics goes like this. Econometrics typically goes like this. It goes model, criterion function, and some proof that if you had infinite amounts of data, this thing would eventually work. And in the limit, it would behave pretty well. So what I mean by those things, formally, that the parameter estimates you're getting out of your data, if you had infinite data, would actually eventually hit the truth. So they would be right with lots of data. And that they would be asymptotically normally distributed, which is to say they'd be kind of bell-shaped around the truth with finite data. Okay. But what they don't do is say anything about optimization. So they don't ever say how you maximize this criterion function. Why machine learning has worked so well is that it's an algorithm. So it says, give me data, follow these steps. I will give you a parameter estimate. And I'm not going to pretend that there's some black box optimizer that's going to do it. In fact, the algorithm will tell you how the optimization works. And moreover, this algorithm is going to often be designed to scale computationally well with large data sets. So it's going to be an algorithm that returns optima and does so quickly, which is to say it's an end-to-end solution in the language of like a technology stack, right? You've got this problem that has a lot of steps. In econometrics, we don't go the last mile, which is optimization. We just say, well, yeah, you figure out how to optimize this. That's like an applied math problem. Whereas the computer scientists go all the way through. And they've just developed some techniques like neural nets, like random forests, which are very good at doing these things. They have some theoretical guarantees, which people are working on in the stats literature. And sometimes they don't. And so you have to be careful not to misuse them. But they work very well in practice. And so one of the misconceptions from a lot of economists is that I don't need to know this stuff because we don't have enough guarantees about it, so we're not really sure how this new thing works. Well, it's just not relevant to my life. It's like great that people out there can use it for prediction or forecasting, but for the kinds of causal or complicated structural analysis I want to do, this isn't a relevant thing. And the answer to that is just like no. It's like, if it doesn't matter what your problem is, if you can state it as a statistical problem, then any number of statistical techniques are applicable to it, including those of machine learning. And actually, some of the best statistical techniques we have right now are machine learning, so you should be using them.
Professor Lewis, I think you really identified the crux of the debate here, because I mean, I still remember taking the undergrad level econometrics course like last year or a year ago. And then a professor mentioned at the very end, the sort of last lecture wrapping up, and was saying, why aren't we talking about machine learning in econometrics? Why are they kind of separate fields? Is because a lot of times machine learning is seen as doing predictions. It's kind of like a black box, whereas economics is a social science. You need to identify causal effects. Are wages caused by more years of education and so on? So whereas you sort of frame this thing as if we're thinking of this as a model for the world, and there are a set of statistics and parameters that we're trying to use to help us uncover some truth, then it's a statistical problem that we should be able to use machine learning techniques to solve. And it's about solving the problem rather than understanding the causality or something per se.
Right. So, I mean, I think that the thing that I would say about this is, when you're thinking about, say, a causal relationship, so say the relationship between sort of education and wages, for example, right? That's a causal relationship you might be interested in understanding. And so what you probably learn in undergrad econometrics is you can run a linear regression of these two, but you're not going to get the causal relationship between years of education and wages, because there are omitted characteristics like the person's ability level. They're very smart, therefore they take more years of education.
Yeah.
They also get a higher income for the same reason. You're not getting the causal effect, right?
Correlation doesn't mean causality.
Perfect. That's the catchphrase. Correlation doesn't mean causation, right? So how does this relate to machine learning? Well, okay. So often, and many data scientists and good tech companies will do this, and they'll make this mistake. They'll just run a regression of wages on education, and they'll use machine learning. They'll say use a random forest, and they'll say, look, I have discovered that this is the effect. And any good economist will say that's not the causal effect. That's not right. Okay. What would an economist say about fixing this? Well, what you learn in undergrad is the technique of instrumental variables. Suppose I could find some instrument which is going to affect years of education, but is not going to influence wages except through its effect on years of education. I'm trying to think what are the classic sort of Well,
a
yeah,
date of birth or something, right?
Date of birth, right? Date of birth and sort of like, yeah, there's a classic paper, right? Oh yeah, so it's date of birth. So I get that as an instrument. Great. So now I've got an instrument, and now you say, good. So now I run 2-stage least squares. I'm Josh Angrist. This is the right thing to do. I run 2-stage least squares. I get results. Okay, great. Now you say, okay, could I do this with a different approach that uses machine learning? And the answer is yes, because it's just statistics. But you do want to use the instrument because you've decided that the valid way, your model of the world is that in computer science terms, your model of the world is that you have unobserved confounders. You do want a causal effect, and therefore you can't do OLS. You have to do something that uses an instrument. Okay, so how could you do this? Well, I have a paper with a past intern of mine, Kevin Chen, who's at Harvard, which says, yeah, you could do 2-stage least squares using machine learning. Where in the first stage of this 2-stage least squares thing, you do any machine learning procedure you like. So you do your best job at predicting years of education from date of birth as well as the other instruments that are valid, right? You fit that completely flexibly. And then, like in 2-stage least squares, you often will regress the outcome variable on the fitted value instead of on the original value. And you can do the same thing here. Now that technically is wrong. So that's intuitive, but not quite right. And you have to do this slight GMM correction, which is a little bit more complicated. But it's not complicated, and it's like 10 lines of Python code. It's not difficult. And I'm saying this mostly to say there are issues that arise when you use machine learning, and you do have to think about it. But it's a statistical technique, and it applies just as well to the problems. And it's just a question of being careful about some of these details. In the same way that even with 2-stage least squares, you have to be careful about some of the details, right?
So what would be some of the limits when it comes to using ML to do statistical inference or causal inference?
So the big word that I think is difficult here is inference. So, if I'm trying to forecast, let's see a good example. Like if I was trying to predict the next word in a sentence, like an autocomplete sort of thing, I might very well use a deep neural net to do that, right? More recurrent neural net, right? And I might be able to do very well at that. And if my phone is actually really good at this, so it autocompletes correctly most of the time, maybe everybody at the tech company is going to be very happy. And nobody really cares how likely it is that I'm going to get it wrong. Like, maybe I make terrible suggestions sometimes, but nobody cares about inference on that, right? However, when I want to do a causal effect, I'm thinking about, changing a policy to raise the minimum wage, to give a policy question, right? I really care a lot about how confident we are that this is going to be either good or bad for wages, for unemployment, right? These are all like good kind of things to worry about. And so I'd like a confidence interval. The one thing that is sad about many machine learning methods is that it's hard to establish valid confidence intervals for reasonably tricky statistical regions. So there are different approaches to doing it, and some of them have better guarantees than others. But it's unlike classical statistics where we have a very clear and well-established body of literature that says, do this. This is the right confidence interval. We don't have that for a lot of machine learning methods. And so it's not so much that the world is not causal that makes it hard to apply machine learning and econometrics. It's more that as an econometrician, I often want to get the right standard errors. And that's a lot harder to do. But you can. We have a package. We have this EconML out of the Alice group. And we have smart people who thought about coverage. And most of our statistical procedures get pretty good coverage, right? So the standard errors are about right. But theoretically, it's tough. And it's tough for reasons. We can get into it if you want to, but the reasons we will definitely go down an academic rabbit hole if you want to talk about the reasons. It's hard to get correct standard errors.
No, totally fine. I don't even understand some of the basics of standard errors and stuff. So yeah, all good. But perhaps there's one paper that we can highlight, which is the deep IV paper. IV stands for instrumental variable, as we just talked about, a very common econometric method. So would you mind giving us a broad overview of that? Because there are concepts like neural nets that I am not too familiar with, which is more harsh domain. So
yeah, I mean, so I'd be happy to. So I think this is sort of a proof of concept. So there are a number of very, very, senior econometricians, Victor Zugov, Whitney Newey, Susan Athey, Hito Imbens, is sort of a very partial list, who have been writing papers at the intersection of econometrics and machine learning, where they've been saying, no, you can use this. Here's how you use it, right? And they've gone into it. And they've provided caveats as well. They've said, I would do this, but I wouldn't do this. I think this is smarter. I think this is valid. I wouldn't, right? So they've been careful about how they've entered this literature. And I got really interested in it. One of my mentors is Susan Athey at Stanford. And so when I saw her writing these papers, I thought, well, I'm sitting at Microsoft too. Maybe I could write some papers in this area. And we happen to have a fantastic econometrician, Matt Taddy. He's a statistician, I'd say. Actually, is a better description from him, from Booth, who was a researcher at the same time that I was at Microsoft. We had a really cool student, Jason Hartford, who was a computer scientist. And then we had his advisor, Kevin Leighton Brown, who was visiting as well. And so we had a really nice crew of people from a different set of areas. And I sort of thought, well, we must be able to do neural nets plus instrumental variables, because like I said, I had this belief that there's nothing that really makes this thing, if you could solve the causal problem, in principle, you can solve it with machine learning. So if you've got an IV, you're fine, just use machine learning. So that's the background. I thought this must be doable. And then it was just the question of trying to figure out how it's doable. And so we really approached this from kind of an interesting perspective, which is what we wanted to do was say, if I have an instrument, is it possible to change, is it possible to basically fit an arbitrary machine learning model, which could be a neural net, that connects the outcome variable to the instruments, and then do some post-processing afterwards to figure out what's the relationship between the treatment variable and the instrument and outcome. And so now I'm realizing that I really have to describe a few things, because otherwise this is going to go badly. So let me start with these big picture objects. There's the outcome. In our case, it would be, say, wages. There's the treatment variable. We often call this in econometrics, which is the thing that you're thinking about changing, like you're changing on education policy. What's the effect of education on that outcome? And then there's an instrument, which in this case is, say, quarter of birth, right? Or we have other applications of the paper that relate to Bing ads. But anyway, so you have this chain of variables. And so one thing you can do for sure is you can relate the instrument to the outcomes. You can say, do wages vary with quarter of birth? Controlling for some other stuff. If you write the quarter of birth as a valid instrument, then they should, because quarter of birth affects education, which affects wages. Unless the treatment effect is zero, you should see really, differences. Okay, but you want to interpret them afterwards. You want to be able to say, well, those things are attributable to education differences. So you also need to know what the relationship between wages and education is, right? And so what we said is, well, those are both problems that can be solved by neural nets. So one of those problems is finding the relationship between the instrument and the outcome variable, and that you can do in some very flexible way you like. And the other thing you could do is, in a very flexible way, is find the relationship between education and quarter of birth, imagining that you're controlling for many other variables at the same time, like income and household composition and demographics, et cetera, right? And so you could use a neural net for that too. That sort of sounds like it would work, that you would be able to use those two models to kind of, in a two-stage least squares kind of way, to figure out what the causal effect is. But it turns out if you're going to make everything nonlinear, things get more complicated. And one thing you need that's a little bit more sophisticated is you actually need to know the distribution of the treatment given the instrument. So if the treatment were binary, turn some policy on or off, it's just like saying as the instrument varies, what's the fraction of times I give you the treatment versus I don't. But in the case where the treatment could take any continuous value, that's a pretty complicated problem. And so a lot of this paper is really at a high level saying, oh, this thing is solvable. And then at a low level going into, okay, but what do we actually have to do? And so one thing you have to do, for example, is you have to fit this first stage called using an approach called mixtures of experts. So I can go into that for a second if that seems interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So so the idea is you want to know the distribution of some treatment variable. say, years of education as a function of the instrument and other controls. One very flexible way to model a distribution of things is as a mixture of normal distributions. So, one normal distribution often is pretty good, but if you have lots of, weird data, then you can put one there, you put one there, you can put one there. Now you've got 3 normal distributions, and that kind of gives you what you need to know. And you need to know sort of where they're centered, what their variance is, and how much weight each of them has. Okay, that summarize the distribution. So that was an insight that came from our intern Jason. He was like, well, it sounds like what you really want to know at a high level is this distribution. We have this technique in computer science called mixtures of experts that uses a neural net to learn this, and it's really good at it. One of the things he did is we had a distribution that was in 2 dimensions that looked like Clippy, the Microsoft art from a long time ago. There was this really irritating assistant who used to pop up on your screen sometimes when you wanted something. I think one of you remembers this.
Harsh knows this probably.
Harsh used to know.
It looked like a pin that you use to like clip together paper and stuff. Yeah.
Exactly.
Two huge eyes.
And it makes suggestions to you.
Yeah.
It's a really weird distribution. If you're trying to like figure out a 2-dimensional distribution that has that shape, it's just super complicated. It turns out you can approximate that extremely well with a mixture of normals, and you can learn it with only like 2,500 data points pretty well. Wow. So that was like a proof of concept that blew me away. I knew very little about Tiger. I knew nothing about neural nets either. I was like, how does this work? I don't know. I hear that's a good approximation device. And then he was like, look, Clippy. And I was like, wow, this is a very good approximation device. Right. And so, that's sort of how this project went, was a lot of like, okay, we know how to do this in principle, but then there are a lot of details. And so most of the paper is trying to take a strong stance on certain kinds of details. This is the right thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do. This is the model I would fit for the neural net. This is not the model I'd fit. I would, for example, so in 2 squares, you have a first stage and then you have a second stage. You do the one thing, then you do the other thing. A lot of times in machine learning, you'll do 2 things at once. You'll say, well, I'm trying to learn this distribution and I'm trying to learn this other set of parameters. Why don't we take gradient steps, again, going to the optimization a little bit, which is important. Why don't I take gradient steps in one problem, then the other problem, then the one problem, then the other problem, the one problem, the other problem? What we figured out for our problem is that actually, we don't want this optimizer of the second stage to be wandering around trying to figure out where to take gradient steps until the first thing is converged, so it kind of knows what problem it's solving. So we solved the entire problem, first stage problem, once in its entirety, and then we let it wander around. And that's what economists have been doing forever. We always do first stage, second stage. But in this particular optimization problem with like harder things, going on, it wasn't obvious that was true. We gave principled reasons why we thought, yeah, no, you still want to do the economist thing. You want to let this whole thing run to convergence once, and you want to take another step and let that run to convergence. I have a different paper where we don't do that, where we do the alternating step thing. So there are these issues that kind of are not so obvious to resolve.
So talking about these issues about neural nets versus traditional statistical machine learning models, the trouble most people have with neural nets is that interpretability, right? Like you can't really know what's going on inside this black box. You just give it a loss function, you give it some data, and by magic everything works out. And so has that sort of impacted your research, because you're sort of trying to understand causality?
Very much so. So I think I don't have a good answer to this yet. So I've kind of decided to straddle the fence on it a little bit. So for example, this paper I mentioned earlier with Kevin and Daniel Chen, Kevin Chen and Daniel Chen, is that what we do in that paper is we say, look, we're going to run a very flexible machine learning model in the first stage, but we're going to run the standard kind of linear regression in the second stage. Why would you do that? Because it's very interpretable. I get a causal effect on, say, wages, and I benefited from the flexibility, but I still have something very interpretable. And we do the same thing actually for judicial decision-making in that paper. It's very complicated to understand how judge assignment relates to the decisions they make, relates to subsequent sentences. But we can figure that out using a machine learning model. In that paper, we showed the machine learning model does a lot better, but it's super interpretable. And so we called that paper Mostly Harmless Machine Learning, after the Josh Angrist book on Mostly Harmless Econometrics, or Josh and somebody else, right? And so the idea is that you can't really get this too wrong. It's like, it's going to give you something that's interpretable, it's sensible. And if you do what we suggest, you're not going to go very far wrong. In other papers, I said, no, let's go full machine learning here. Let's go neural net, right? And then you need interpretation ex post, because the neural net is not very interpretable. So now you need tools like SHAP, which people have developed, for example. There are these approaches that allow you to interpret your neural net results afterwards in various ways. And so that's the other direction to go, is fit the most general model you like, fit the model that you think describes the world as flexibly as you can. And then let's add some other tools afterwards that help you make sense of this. And we found in our work with EconML that that's important. If you're going to allow flexible models, you have to allow tools that allow people to make sense of what they found.
Professor Lewis, just I guess another concrete example that you used in the paper is this airline example. You said, like, airlines gradually increase prices because planes fill more around holidays, and if you have like a very naive machine learning model, that would suggest increasing prices any other time of the year would kind of have the same effect, or so on. But you're saying that there are better ways that we can predict pricing, maybe around like busy conferences or other factors we can consider, and then it's sort of a more powerful algorithm for this kind of instrumental variable analysis, and it would allow you to eventually make counterfactual claims and perform causal inference. So I think there are kind of multiple jumps here that in the way I explained this thing. So it seems I was describing airlines, suddenly I explained like a breakthrough. So I guess, would you mind connecting some of the dots for us, like counterfactual, inference in that context?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the way to think about IV in particular is that, if you've got a good instrument, and it depends a little bit on the quality of your instrument, you can learn a lot about the world, causally about the world, right? And the challenge is to extract as much information from your instrument as possible, because that's really your source of an experiment, right? So in the quarter of birth is the experiment that's using you, that is changing people's education decisions effectively at random, which is allowing you to learn something about the world. And then there are two kinds of separate things I would think about here. One is, what's the mapping from the instrument to the treatment variable? And I'd like to make that mapping as flexible as I can, because in some sense, I don't ever care about interpreting it. I don't need to know exactly why quarter of birth causes education, although maybe that would be a nice thing to do. I just need to know that it is a valid experiment. If you're telling me it's a valid experiment, I want to really lean on it and squeeze all the information out of it that I can. Okay, so that's one thing. That's sort of why we think using machine learning in that step makes sense. Then there's a second step, which is the relationship between education and wages. And in two-stage least squares, you'll assume that's linear, right, typically. And that's a good parametric form. It's simple. But you might think that it's nonlinear, right? We do advertising and ad exposures you think are highly nonlinear. It's very effective seeing the ad once, it's less effective at seeing it twice. They're definitely diminishing returns. And so it's probably going to have a curve that tails off, right, for example. And if you had a ton of data, you'd really like to be very, very flexible and let the data tell you what that relationship is, rather than specifying in advance that it's a line, right? And so that's the appeal of machine learning in the second step. The appeal of machine learning in the first step is to squeeze all the power out of your instruments. The appeal of machine learning in your second step is to be very, very flexible. And that second part, really has to scale with your data. If you've got a very few data points, then it's hard to really move beyond being linear if you've got like 200 data points. If you have 200,000 data points, then maybe you can say much more nuanced things. Maybe you can say that the people that respond to education are primarily people from low-income households, but additional education doesn't do very much for people from high-income households. The data might be able to tell you that, and it might be able to tell you that in an automatic way using machine learning, without you as a researcher trying to have to figure out all these different hypotheses and test them one by one.
So it seems like the sort of black boxy nature of neural nets is sort of helping you, right? Instead of designing a kernel for sort of vector machines and stuff, like exactly telling the sort of machine learning model, like, hey, I want you to plot like an exponential data or like a Gaussian fit. You're like sort of just letting the data sort of speak for itself, so to speak.
Yeah, so this falls into the land of non-parametric statistics, right? It says I'm not going to be parametric. I'm gonna let the data tell me. And non-parametric statistics, as I say, we've known a lot about. I mean, the beautiful papers are written on this for decades in econometrics, but they haven't really been applied that much. And I think a lot of that is about optimization. It's about how do you optimize this thing, especially in high dimensions. So in, again, sort of technical for a brief second, in lower dimensions, you can do things where you can fit like very nice little kernels and you can smooth data. You can get very beautiful smooths. But in high dimensions, that's hard. And so you really need a tool that does this well. Neural nets do this well, random forests do this well. A lot of the things that have been proposed prior to that just don't do it very well. And so people didn't use them. And so, yeah, it's really the appeal of being able to let your data speak rather than having to pre-specify what you think is going to happen and then go look for it in the data.
I was just gonna say, oh my God, Harsh, you were just dropping buzzwords left and right. He was like kernel, Gaussian,
vector machine,
super vector machine. I'm like, okay, Super Mario Kart. Well, like, what are we doing here? Anyways, Professor Lewis, I guess one other curious thing kind of on my mind is this idea of data. Right? We're talking about like big data all the time. Like people often associate machine learning and big data together. It seems that you need a lot of data points to learn. How does that aspect play into your research, and also how does Microsoft kind of support that? Because I imagine under the surveillance capitalism regime, Microsoft has so much data.
Yeah, right. Okay, good. So a couple of things. So one is to say, I used to think that was true because that's typically what we think is you need a lot of data to train very fancy models. And it's actually a little bit more subtle than that. If you do the machine learning right, you do need a lot of data to find very complex patterns in the data. If you're trying to look for something very complicated with like a very few data points, you're probably going to find something that's not actually there. Like it's like looking at 100 data points and like it's like a Rorschach test, and you're like, find me a flamingo, and you're like, okay, I guess I can sort of see a flamingo there, right? So that's not a, that doesn't work great. But good machine learning models will look at the ink blot and say, I can't tell you there's a flamingo. In fact, the only thing I can do is really tell you that there's a line. That's all I got for you here. It's a line. You give me 100,000 points, maybe I'll see the flamingo. But right, so I think it's not necessary, but it certainly helps if you're trying to kind of use the real power of machine learning, which is to find complicated things. Okay, so what about Microsoft? So Microsoft is a place where, of course, we do have a lot of data. It's like any real company. Data sits within product groups. Microsoft Research is a ways away from many product groups, right? And so we sit here, and there's a product group here, and a product group here, and a product group here. And the product groups are very careful about access to data for privacy reasons, right? So we don't want to misuse our customers' data. And so any kind of proposal that you might want to run by them is going to have to go through some privacy review. And it's going to involve a lot of anonymization. It's going to have to be careful, and we're going to have to be careful about how we do that. For my research, I've actually, I do some research that's sort of Microsoft internal. So that is to say, it's not really going to ever surface as academic research. And that, that in those cases, I touch the data when I'm allowed to. I go through the privacy review, and I get to use large data sets, and that's great. But to be honest, a lot of those problems that I'm solving are not really big data problems in some sense. I'm often thinking about economics problems. I'm thinking about Microsoft's customer base, and especially its big customer base. And that may be 50,000 major companies, right? And we're thinking about, how do we better serve our customers, or what kinds of sales incentives are effective. And so that's a different kind of problem. It's still actually very much in the realm of kind of like small data econometrics. And so that's the sort of stuff I mostly do.
Professor Lewis, maybe we can pivot a little bit to a slightly lighter note, slightly less technical note, which is a comparison between Microsoft research and academia. This is something I'm personally quite curious about. And you spent many years at Harvard before going to Microsoft research. You were associate professor, assistant professor. You obviously spent many years getting PhDs and stuff. So, I mean, personally, I was very much thinking about whether I should pursue a PhD in economics this past year. And Harsh is a soon-to-be PhD student in physics, and some of our best friends are going to get PhDs in computer science. But it's really interesting from my perspective, because a lot of my friends who don't do economics, who study computer science PhDs, their goal is not to become professors. Their goal is to get a PhD, get the skill set, and either do their own startup or then go work for Google Research or Microsoft Research, because it seems to them that's a much better research environment. It's more flexibility. You don't have to think about tenure. And then whereas in econ has traditionally been a field much more constrained in that way. You get a PhD in order to go to academia. Like it's like 90% of the Harvard graduates, go into like teach at state schools or something, rather than go work for Goldman Sachs or startups. So I would love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on that contrast. And I imagine the econ researchers at Microsoft Research is still a much smaller compared to the other fields.
Yeah, I mean, we're a pretty small crew. There are 3 of us in Microsoft Research New England, and there are a bunch of other economists in other parts of the company. Yeah, so I think that, what's the right way to say this? Yeah, Microsoft is one of the few companies that's taken the research model that the computer science folks have, that you'll see at like Google Brain or Google Research, and said, this is a model we want to embrace for economists. We think that this is the right way to use economists within a company, is we're going to let them continue to do their research and think about what they like to think about. And then we're going to try and transfer the insights into product. So really, I think you can think of like there being, there probably are more, but let me say for the purpose of this, let's say there are 3 kinds of basic categories. There's academia, and in academia, you're producing 2 products. You're producing research unconstrained by anything. You can think about whatever you like, and teaching. You're teaching the next generation of people to be good scholars, right? So those are things you're producing. In a lab like mine or Google Brain or something like that, again, it's research. We want you to be doing state-of-the-art things, but it's product impact. It's produce research, and then at some point, why don't we figure out how to make that research go into products? And so the time horizon on that can be pretty long. In fact, it'd be kind of similar to academia in the sense that you might be thinking 5-10 years out, but ultimately, the hope is that there will be an applied impact. Whereas in pure academia, in some sense, you can just write something because you think it's interesting. And you might think it will never turn into anything. I mean, I was just rereading because it felt kind of fun. Bill Gates has a paper on pancake flipping from when he was an undergrad. And his co-author at the time was Christos Papadimitriou, who's a very, very, very brilliant computer scientist and who was at Harvard at the time. And they wrote this paper together, and Bill apparently didn't find it that interesting. He worked on it, and then he kind of decided to start a company. And Christos carried on. That's eventually published. But that pancake flipping, how do you do it optimally? Not obviously applied, although often these things are subtle and eventually end up in applied stuff. And then the third category are people where they think that you have a great skill set, but they don't want you to be doing research. What they want you to be doing is actually figuring out how to make this company more effective, more efficient, more productive. And so Amazon has gone this direction in econ. So where do economists go who don't go to academia? They go lots of places, but one big employer, the biggest employer of economists in the world, I think the PhD economists in the world at this point, is Amazon.
Yeah, more than the Federal Reserve, which is so absurd.
It's wild, right? And it's because they've taken this bet. And actually, my advisor is the chief economist there, Pat Byrie, has taken this bet that academic economists are people with exactly the right skill set that we need. And he's obviously been successful in convincing his superiors at Amazon this is true because they've been effective, right? And so that's now this third career option. And I think it's in part a reflection of his success that we don't see many people in the middle category. It's either go do something like litigation consulting, which economists often do, or go do something that's very much not research but real world focused, or go to research on an academic but not this middle ground of let's do research that will eventually become applied. And so we're in this weird position. There are not that many of us doing this.
So Professor Lewis, will you be fired in 10 years if you don't make the next new iPhone for Microsoft or something?
Great question. No, I think this is the answer. I hope. I don't know. My bosses tell me that, and I'm an economist. I think about this a bit too. My bosses tell me that it's sort of suboptimal to start firing people because everybody will get very skittish, right? Everybody will be like, oh no, yeah. They can fire me. If they can fire me, they can fire other people too, right? So Yeah, I think it's more likely that they'll just be like, you know what, this was a great experiment. Research, very interesting. But in fact, bad use of resources. We're going to just take all those people and scatter them to product groups. They will all do, more effective work in the third category that I was talking about before.
I see. Because I think Uber even hires economists these days.
Oh yeah, Uber does.
So Uber, Amazon, I imagine these processes are more for how to make
Facebook,
Facebook.
Airbnb, Pinterest.
What do they do? It sounds creepy. Why does Amazon need an economist to know what I want to buy?
Oh, they don't. They need machine learning. What they need is an economist to describe how to make more money from this process of you buying things. How to decide, or how to make you happier. I mean, I'll take the Amazon view too. How to delight the customers. Those are both valuable perspectives.
Wow. Harsh, we can't hear you for some reason.
You're not muted, but.
It's fine. We can edit this small hiccup out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah, I was going to say, you think traditional academia research is sort of doesn't see the light of day as often. Like a lot of ideas get lost there because you were like, I think you gave this example like in the middle of our talk that, that a lot of economists and stuff leave it at like, oh, this should be optimized or this, like optimize this function somehow. And like, don't really worry about how it's done, right? And like, because they probably don't have much time they have to get to the next paper. They can't write all the Python code and make it available on like GitHub or something. But as opposed to Microsoft, where like, you have your Alice project and econML, which are available to the public, and you are incentivized to like, put these things through the pipeline until they see the light of day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of economists, let's be honest about a lot of academia. A lot of academics are constrained by teaching. In some sense, this is sort of fundamental to what they do. It's probably the most useful thing that they're producing, in some sense, is good education for folks. But it also just doesn't leave a lot of time for them to do research, right? And so I think that's one part of it. I think another thing that's true of academia, but would be true of companies as well, in different ways, is that what you produce is a function of what you're surrounded by. So if you're sitting at a company, you're going to produce a very particular kind of research. You're going to say, oh, I think these questions are interesting. Even if you've got a lot of freedom like I do, you'll be exposed to certain kinds of things. The same is true in academia. You're going to go to conferences, you're going to see what other people are interested in. You're going to write a lot of papers on the kinds of things they're interested in. So I think in both these cases, there's kind of like a path dependence a little bit. Going back to the beginning of our talk, right? It's where you start is where you end up. And I think that, hopefully the very best ideas do see the light of day, but you can wait sometimes. I mean, I think Meyerson has a beautiful paper in like 1982 about optimal auctions. And I don't think it was appreciated at the time, but it's certainly, he won a Nobel Prize later, so it's certainly eventually got appreciated, right? And so hopefully the best ideas will eventually float to the top, but there's no guarantee that that's true. And there's no guarantee that that academics are optimally resourced to write the very best work. So it's a harsh economy out there.
Do you think academia is fundamentally driven by theoretical excitement, theoretical intellectual excitement, rather than real world impact per se? In other words, people who go to academia are those who are ultimately excited by theoretical problems or challenges, rather than saying, I need to see my work save this amount of lives, because then you can go into policy. You don't need a Ph.D. You might want to go to Wall Street or nonprofit or something. So,
Tiger, I don't think Wall Street saves lives, but
probably not. Yeah, I think it's easy to generalize and come up with an answer that's going to obviously not reflect a lot of people's motivations. But I do think that people who are drawn to academia are often drawn to neat solutions. That is to say, I want to be able to frame a problem, and I want to be able, and now I'm really skipping a lot of academia, right? I don't think this is true of English professors, right? But at least the sort of technical problems we're thinking about, econ maybe, I'd like to be able to describe a problem and describe a solution to it. Or I'd like to be able to describe a true fact about the world. I'd like to be able to say something like, I really think that education reform is going to matter in this way. But so there's an academic pipeline that looks like problem, technique, solution. And that's true in all kinds of, biology, problem, experiment, solution, right? And there's innovation in the process for getting that, from A to B. But ultimately, it often is going to be kind of possible to do this work on a limited, without a huge scale, right? It's going to be sort of limited in how many people are required. And it's often going to feel like it's quite solvable. And I think some of the biggest things that we see in the world, I don't know, Amazon, for example, is an entire company, right? It is about sort of taking on something that's much, much bigger than that scope, where you couldn't possibly think that you could solve it by yourself. You're not even sure if it's possibly solvable, right? And you're willing to just try, and because you think it could be cool and it could impact a lot of people. And I think that, I think a lot of academics are drawn to things that are a little bit smaller in scale, because they like getting neat solutions. I mean, we're all people who excelled at school. We like being right at some level, right?
Have you ever felt that that your research has been constrained by Microsoft being sort of risk averse to some extent? They manage a lot of people's data and privacy. They're probably extremely careful about things. Maybe
they're
like a
very
startup
careful
would
about
probably...
things, but I haven't found it to be a constraint at all for the research I've done. I can imagine it being a constraint for people who really need to touch private data, that could feel limiting. And I mean, there are definitely times when I'm like, oh, that would be a really fun research project. Like, why don't we look at all of our personnel data and try to understand? I mean, they're great questions, actually really important social questions. Like, we're a huge company, we make a lot of hiring decisions. We're very concerned nowadays about sort of various forms of subjective bias, racial equity, gender equity, right? Microsoft as a company is very concerned about this, but they'd be very, very reluctant to let people investigate that deeply, because if it turns out we've done a bad job on this, right, that's not great. In some sense, it's just a box you don't want to open, because it may turn out that the answer is not what you like. We may actually have done great in the past, but everybody can anticipate, look forward and go, there's some potentially really bad outcomes here. Let's just not open that box, right? And so, there are constraints like that, but I think you can understand why they exist.
You can start asking questions like what do Princeton students think when they're sleeping at night or something? Psychoanalyze some people a little bit. Soul-searching questions.
With the power of all their search results. I mean, it's not, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Yeah. I mean, that would be kind of terrifying, right? Yeah. Well, what about think about like Facebook trying to recommend people who might need access to a suicide hotline. And that's sort of in this very complicated space, which thankfully I don't have to delve into, between being creepy and very socially valuable. Of course, we don't want people to feel depressed and alone and helpless and worried about committing suicide. But on the other hand, it is kind of fundamentally creepy if they're trying to figure that out from all your data, right? And so how do you feel about that? I think there are really good challenges, which I think that a lot of my colleagues at Microsoft who are more in the social media space are starting to grapple with. Like, what is creepy? What's okay? What's too much? What are the rules that we should be establishing to make things work better? I think they're really interesting policy questions there.
I see. I guess, Professor Lewis, as we gradually wrap up, what do you see as some of the frontier topics, either in the intersection between machine learning and economics, or machine learning at large, or economics at large? What are some of the new frontiers you're trying to push, urgent challenges you're trying to think about next? I'm trying to steal some paper topics here. I'm just...
Yeah, it's good. It's good. You should go. Yeah. No, I think like for me, I mean, I'm really interested in this machine learning econometrics frontier. I think that trying to understand how to build solutions that are just as good a recipe as ordinary least squares, right? I mean, at some level, you want to get the rules of the game so well established that everybody goes, okay, yes, we understand that. And that's in part about writing papers and coming up with frontier techniques, but it's also about simplifying. It's also about consolidating. It's also about educating. It's about saying, oh yeah, this is a solution that's robust, that scales well, that doesn't give you wrong results very often, that everybody can understand, so we can start teaching it to people. I think that's sort of one big thing. And then the other thing I think some about, and I have colleagues who think more about, but I just think it's such an important question, is the role of AI in society. I think that there are going to be all these really, really difficult questions around who should have data, how should they use their data, etc. Okay, let me give you a third one. Sorry, I just thought of a third one. I was talking about that. Is I'm really interested in this question of recommendations and market power. So we talked about this earlier. How much power do tech firms have? But for law purposes, it's really important to have simple tests of market power, like things that are not that complicated to figure out, to tell you if you think that a merger of, well, going back to the day, a merger of Facebook and Instagram is a terrible idea. Okay. How much power do they have as a result of that? Well, you know, there are ways of thinking about that, and there are already some ways of, that exist, but I think that they, to some extent, they don't maybe reflect the full reality of the tools that are at the disposal of these tech companies. And the part of it that I think about primarily is just this rankings part. It's just sort of trying to understand, you know, if a company really wanted you to buy a thing, how effective could they be at that? Because if they're really effective at it, then they should be able to grab a lot of money from whoever produces that thing. If OXO can convince me to buy all my kitchen stuff from OXO, or if Amazon convinced me to buy all my kitchen stuff from OXO, then OXO starts to look like an Amazon subsidiary, because they make the things, but Amazon does all the sales and marketing for them effectively, right? And so now that, you know, they're two separate companies, but the bargain they can strike can be extremely favorable to Amazon, right? And so I think that's interesting too.
So the punchline of this interview is to break up Amazon and Facebook.
Yeah,
and
that's exactly what I was going for. I mean, you should break up all of our major competitors. Anybody who's competing with Microsoft, I think strong antitrust action is.
It would be funny if that is the sole mission, that's the secret mission of Microsoft Research, is to produce research that could prove how we can break up everybody else. Like that, if at the frontier of econ, computer science, and ethics research, like Microsoft Research has a great group of people. I mean, I have some of the books here. You mentioned the social media side of things.
Yes.
Mary Gray, who wrote
Yes.
Ghost Work. I can't see the book right now. But anyways, yeah, it would be so funny if they're just writing about Amazon's content moderation. Oh my God, these people are evil.
I mean, you know, sometimes these things are correlated, right? Like it's, you know, like there's, right? The world is a complicated place. There are problems with it, and people propose that things be done about it. But maybe those are, you know, related. I mean, yeah. In all seriousness, I think that the beautiful thing about Microsoft Research is that it gives people a really good platform to spread these very valuable messages, right? There are people that are thinking deeply about society, and they have a nice platform from which to share those messages.
So when you work at Microsoft Research, which in some way we can see as the new frontier of Bell Lab, or maybe kind of a proxy today, are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future we're headed? Because you see all the people around you who are doing these research. It's probably intellectually fascinating for sure, but do you walk away every day thinking, yeah, we're kind of screwed, or this is great?
I think I'm a techno optimist.
I love that phrase.
I don't know if that's the right phrase, but I think that there's a lot of power in technology to make the world better. And I think that what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how not to screw that up, to put it bluntly, right? Like, you know, it's like you've got all this promise, but you want to do the right thing with the promise you have. And so society needs to step in. Regulation is important. Understanding what the limits to that should be are important. Worrying about the power of tech companies is important, right? These are all things that we should worry about. But I think ultimately we're worrying about this because we've got these incredibly powerful tools now, and you want to steer them in the right direction. I think if we could steer them in the right direction, that's great. And we didn't talk about this, but I think, you know, I think the things that I'm worried about more that make me more pessimistic are much more around attention, right? And this is an entirely different topic, but, you know, but thinking about how people are unable to step away from their electronic devices, their ability to be present, their ability to be social, their ability to interact. I worry more about that. And I don't know if, you know, and there you could worry that the tech companies are more of a problem because their incentives are tied very much to keeping you on these devices. And these devices are incredibly powerful and are incredibly useful. And they do give you incredibly powerful tools, which is why you use them. But sometimes I wonder a little bit whether we're starting to lose our ability to be human, at least human as we were.
No. Wow. I mean, we're going to end the interview like at this point, and then later I'm going to reflect on the last sentence you say. It was like, wait, did Professor Lewis just say like we're not going to be humans anymore? Like what did he just reveal at the last minute?
This could go on to be a whole nother interview.
Yeah, exactly. So last question, since the name of our show is Policy Punchline, what would your punchline be for today? But besides the fact that Microsoft Research is a scheme to unravel all the competitors, which we've gotten already, but in addition to that,
it's a good punchline. Maybe I will give you a research punchline, which is that machine learning is a statistical tool, and it can be applied in economics, and it should be applied in economics.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for joining us. It's just been such a wonderful interview. Yeah.
A pleasure. It's
yeah, truly a pleasure.
And Harsh, thanks so much for joining me today. This concludes.
It's great as always, Tiger.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
it was an honor to interview Professor Lewis. Had such a good conversation, which is really good.
Exactly. Well, this concludes this episode of Policy Punchline. Please visit us on policypunchline.com. You may watch this video on YouTube, follow us on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud. You can learn more about Microsoft Research at microsoft.com/en/us/research. And you can read more about Professor Lewis' work. Simply Google him, Greg Lewis. So this concludes this episode. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.